Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern power struggles, a single moment of humiliation would spark a royal confrontation that no one saw coming. When Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter and arguably the most fearless member of the royal family, witnessed something that made her blood boil, she didn't hesitate for even a second. What happened next would send shockwaves through the palace corridors, strip away carefully maintained facades, and prove that sometimes the most powerful response isn't a royal decree or a diplomatic statement. It's immediate, decisive action that cuts deeper than any sword. This isn't just another royal drama. This is the story of how one princess's unwavering sense of justice collided head-on with palace politics, and how a single act of defiance changed everything for everyone involved. Because when Princess Anne decides someone has crossed the line, she doesn't wait for permission, protocols, or second thoughts. She acts. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Princess Anne made her way through the East Wing, her footsteps echoing with the authority that came naturally to someone who had spent 73 years navigating the complexities of royal life. She had always been different from her brothers, more direct, less concerned with diplomatic niceties, and absolutely unwilling to tolerate injustice in any form. That Tuesday morning started like any other, with and reviewing her schedule for the upcoming state visit. As the hardest-working member of the royal family, she took her responsibilities seriously, often completing more engagements in a single year than some of her relatives managed in 3. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to witness. The trouble had been brewing for months, though most people in the palace chose to ignore the subtle signs. Ever since King Charles had officially made Camilla his queen consort, there had been a gradual shift in the palace dynamics. Camilla's staff, emboldened by their boss's elevated position, had begun exercising authority that many felt went beyond their actual roles. James Morrison had been a palace guard for 15 years. He was the kind of man who took pride in his service, who polished his boots until they gleamed, and who knew every protocol by heart. His colleagues respected him, and even his senior royals acknowledged him with genuine warmth. James had served through 3 monarchs, had been present during some of the most significant moments in recent royal history, and had never once received a complaint about his conduct. But on this particular morning, James found himself at the center of a confrontation that would change everything. It started when Camilla's private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, approached James at his post near the Queen Consort's private apartments. Margaret had joined Camilla's team only 6 months earlier, but she carried herself with the kind of arrogance that suggested she believed her proximity to royalty made her royalty herself. "Guard," Margaret said, not bothering to use James's name despite having been introduced to him multiple times. "Her Majesty requires complete privacy for her morning routine. I need you to ensure that absolutely no one, and I mean no one, disturbs this corridor for the next 2 hours." James nodded respectfully. "Of course, ma'am. I'll make sure the corridor remains secure. That includes other members of the royal family," Margaret continued, her tone becoming sharper. "The Queen Consort has made it clear that she doesn't want any unexpected visitors today." This gave James pause. While he understood the need for privacy, the idea of preventing other royals from accessing parts of their own home seemed unusual. "Ma'am, with respect, if another member of the family needs to pass through—" "Did I stutter?" Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "I said no one means no one. Are you questioning the Queen Consort's direct orders?" James felt his face flush, but he maintained his composure. "No, ma'am. I'm simply clarifying the protocol." "The protocol is what I tell you it is," Margaret snapped. "And if you can't follow simple instructions, perhaps we need to reconsider whether you're suitable for this position." What Margaret didn't realize was that Princess Anne had been approaching from the opposite end of the corridor, planning to visit her sister-in-law to discuss arrangements for an upcoming charity event they were both supporting, and had excellent hearing, and she caught every word of the exchange. She watched, hidden partially by a marble column, as Margaret continued her verbal assault on James. The guard stood at attention, his jaw tight with controlled frustration, but maintaining the dignity that had made him such a respected member of the palace staff. Furthermore, Margaret continued, clearly enjoying her display of power, I want you to understand that things are changing around here. The Queen Consort has specific expectations about how her staff should be treated, and that extends to how we interact with the security personnel. We expect a level of deference that reflects our position in the hierarchy. Anne's hands clenched into fists. She had witnessed enough workplace bullying in her time to recognize it immediately, and she had zero tolerance for anyone who used their position to humiliate others. I'll also need you to provide me with a written report of everyone who approaches this area today, Margaret added. The Queen Consort wants to know exactly who's been trying to access her private spaces. Ma'am, James said quietly, that would require me to file reports on other members of the royal family, which goes against established protocol. Margaret stepped closer to James, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. Are you refusing a direct order from the Queen Consort's office? I'm not refusing anything, ma'am. I'm simply explaining the existing protocols. Well, the protocols are changing, Margaret said with a cold smile. And if you can't adapt, I'm sure we can find someone who can. Someone who understands that loyalty to the Queen Consort comes before outdated procedures. And had heard enough. She stepped out from behind the column, her presence immediately commanding the attention of both Margaret and James. The guard's relief was visible, though he maintained his professional stance. Is there a problem here? Anne asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of royal service and an absolute intolerance for nonsense. Margaret's demeanor changed instantly, though she tried to maintain her authoritative air. Your Royal Highness, I was just clarifying some security arrangements with the guard. I see, and said, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. And these arrangements involve humiliating a 15-year veteran of palace security in the corridor of his own workplace? I was simply ensuring that the Queen Consort's privacy requirements are met, Margaret replied, though her confidence was clearly shaken. By threatening a man's livelihood for doing his job correctly? Anne's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm surface. By demanding he violate established protocols that have kept this family safe for decades. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, and continued. I heard every word of your conversation, Miss Thornfield. Every threat, every demand, every attempt to use your position to bully someone who has served this family with distinction for longer than you've been employed here. James remained at attention, but I could see the gratitude in his eyes. In her years of public service, she had learned that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Furthermore, and continued, I'm curious about these new protocols you mentioned. Who exactly authorized you to determine which members of the royal family can access which areas of their own homes? Margaret's face flushed red. The Queen Consort has certain expectations. The Queen Consort, and interrupted, is married to my brother. She is not, however, in a position to override centuries of royal protocol or to authorize the harassment of dedicated staff members. The corridor fell silent, except for the distant sounds of palace life continuing around them. Margaret looked trapped, caught between backing down and maintaining the facade of authority she had been projecting. I think, Anne said, her tone suggesting this was not actually a suggestion, that you and I need to have a conversation about appropriate workplace conduct. James, thank you for your service today. Please continue with your duties as you see fit, following established protocols. Yes, Your Royal Highness, James replied, the relief evident in his voice, and turned her attention back to Margaret. My office. Now, as they walked away and reflected on what she had witnessed. This wasn't just about one overzealous staff member exercising poor judgment. This was symptomatic of a larger problem that had been developing within the palace structure. The integration of Camilla's team into the existing royal household had not been seamless, and it was clear that some members of her staff had developed an inflated sense of their own importance. But What troubled him most was the realization that if she hadn't happened to be in that corridor at that exact moment, James would have faced that humiliation alone. How many other incidents like this had occurred without anyone in a position of authority to witness them? The walk to Anne's office was conducted in tense silence. Margaret's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that she had made a serious error in judgment. Anne's reputation for directness and intolerance for bullying was well known throughout the palace, and Margaret was beginning to understand that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Anne's office reflected her personality, functional, organized, and free of unnecessary ostentation. The walls were lined with photographs from her decades of public service, images that captured her, with everyone from Olympic athletes to aid workers in remote corners of the world. These photos told the story of someone who had spent her life in service to others, someone who understood the value of hard work and dedication. "Sit down," Anne said, settling behind her desk with the kind of calm that often preceded storm. Margaret perched nervously on the edge of the chair, her earlier arrogance completely abandoned. "I want to understand something," Anne began. "In the 6 months you've been employed here, what exactly has led you to believe that humiliating long-serving staff members falls within your job description?" Margaret struggled to find words. "Your Royal Highness, I was simply trying to ensure that the Queen Consort's needs were met. By threatening a man's career? By demanding he violate protocols that exist for very good reasons?" And leaned forward slightly. "Or by suggesting that your position gives you authority over established royal procedures?" "I may have been a bit direct," Margaret admitted weakly. "Direct?" Anne's eyebrows rose. "You told a decorated guard that if he couldn't show proper deference to you, he should consider whether he was suitable for his position. You demanded that he file reports on the movements of members of the royal family. You invaded his personal space in an attempt to intimidate him. Which part of that do you consider merely direct?" The silence stretched between them as Margaret realized the full extent of her mistake. She had not only overstepped her authority, but had done so in front of the one member of the royal family least likely to tolerate such behavior. And continued, her voice remaining level, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've spent my entire adult life working with dedicated professionals who understand that respect is earned, not demanded. What I witnessed today was not leadership. It was abuse of position, and it will not be tolerated in this household." Margaret finally found her voice. "What does this mean for my position?" And stood up, signaling that the conversation was nearing its end. "What it means is that you have demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of your role here. You are not royalty, Miss Thornfield. You are an employee, and, like all employees, you are expected to treat your colleagues with respect and dignity. I understand, Your Royal Highness." "Do you?" Anne asked, because understanding and demonstrating understanding are two very different things. As Anne prepared to dismiss Margaret, she made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. This conversation was not going to be the end of the matter. It was going to be the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the palace as Princess and made her way toward King Charles's private study. Her conversation with Margaret Thornfield had ended with a clear directive. Such behavior would not be repeated, and any future incidents would result in immediate dismissal. But Anne knew that addressing the symptom wouldn't cure the disease. The real conversation needed to happen with Camilla herself, and had always prided herself on her directness, a quality that had sometimes put her at odds with the more diplomatic members of her family, but had also earned her respect both within the palace and among the public. She knocked on her brother's study door with the same confidence she brought to every aspect of her life. "Come in," Charles called from inside, and entered to find both Charles and Camilla seated in the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, apparently discussing arrangements for an upcoming state dinner. The scene was domestic and peaceful, which made what Anne was about to discuss all the more jarring. "And," Charles said with genuine warmth, "what brings you by this afternoon?" "I need to discuss a staffing matter with you both," Anne replied, her tone indicating this was not a social visit. Camilla looked up from the papers she had been reviewing, her expression neutral but alert. She had learned over the years to read the subtle signals that indicated when and was operating in her official capacity versus her familial one, and everything about Anne's demeanor suggested this was very much an official matter. "Of course," Charles said, gesturing for Anne to take a seat. "What's concerning you?" And remained standing, a position that unconsciously emphasized the serious nature of her visit. "This morning, I witnessed one of Camilla's staff members, Margaret Thornfield, engaging in what can only be described as workplace harassment of one of our security personnel." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Charles's expression shifted from casual interest to serious attention, while Camilla's face remained carefully composed. "I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding," Camilla said carefully. "There was no misunderstanding," and replied firmly. "I observed the entire interaction. Miss Thornfield threatened James Morrison's employment, demanded that he violate established security protocols, and subjected him to a pattern of behavior that would be considered unacceptable in any workplace, let alone the royal household." Charles frowned. "That's a serious allegation, and—" "It's not an allegation, Charles. It's a statement of fact. I was there. I heard every word." Anne's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "And what concerns me even more is that this suggests a larger problem with how some of the newer staff members understand their roles and responsibilities." Camilla finally spoke, her voice measured but with an edge of defensiveness. "Margaret is usually very professional. If there was an incident, I'm sure it was simply a miscommunication about security procedures." And turned her full attention to Camilla, and those who knew her well would have recognized the warning signs in her posture and expression. It wasn't a miscommunication about security procedures. It was a deliberate attempt to use proximity to power as a weapon against someone who couldn't fight back. "That's rather dramatic language," Camilla replied. "Is it?" and asked. "When a staff member tells a 15-year veteran of palace security that he needs to show proper deference to her personally, when she threatens his job for following established protocols, when she invades his personal space to intimidate him, what would you call that?" The room fell silent. Charles looked between his wife and his sister, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that was building between them. "And," he said finally, "I appreciate your bringing this to our attention. We'll certainly look into the matter." "You look into it?" Anne's voice rose slightly. "Charles, this isn't something that requires investigation. I witnessed it firsthand. The question isn't whether it happened. It's what you're going to do about it." Camilla shifted in her chair, her composure beginning to show cracks. "I think you may be overreacting to what was probably just a misunderstanding about chain of command." "Overreacting," and repeated, and both Charles and Camilla recognized the dangerous calm in her voice. "Let me be very clear about something. I have spent 50 years in public service. I have worked with thousands of dedicated professionals, from palace staff to charity workers to military personnel. I know the difference between leadership and bullying, and what I witnessed today was absolutely unacceptable. Of course, we all want our staff to maintain professional standards," Camilla began. "Do we?" and interrupted. "Because from where I stand, it seems like some members of your team have developed the impression that their association with you gives them license to treat other palace employees as subordinates rather than colleagues." Charles cleared his throat, attempting to mediate. "I'm sure we can resolve this through proper channels. Perhaps a meeting with the household staff leadership." "No, Charles," and said firmly. "This isn't going to be resolved through committees and meetings. This is going to be resolved right now, in this room." She turned back to Camilla. "I want to understand something. Did you authorize Margaret Thornfield to prevent members of the royal family from accessing areas of the palace?" "Of course not," Camilla replied quickly. "Did you instruct her to demand written reports on the movements of family members?" "Absolutely not." "Did you tell her that established security protocols could be overridden at her discretion?" "No, I would never." "Then explain to me," and said, her voice cutting through Camilla's protests, "how a woman who has worked for you for 6 months came to believe that she had the authority to do all of those things in your name." Camilla's face flushed. I can't control every word that comes out of my staff members' mouths. Can't you? And asked. Because leadership is exactly that, taking responsibility for the actions of the people who work under your direction. And when those people abuse their positions, it reflects directly on you. Charles finally intervened more forcefully. And I think we all agree that any inappropriate behavior needs to be addressed. But perhaps we could discuss this more constructively. And looked at her brother with a mixture of affection and exasperation. Charles, do you remember when we were children and you would try to avoid conflict by suggesting that everyone just needed to be more understanding of each other? This is different, Charles protested. Is it? Because it seems to me that you're trying to smooth over a serious problem rather than address it directly. Anne's voice softened slightly as she addressed her brother, but her resolve remained firm. James Morrison has served this family faithfully for 15 years. He has protected us, respected us, and never once given anyone cause to question his integrity or competence. And today he was humiliated by someone who has been here for 6 months. She turned back to Camilla, and the reason she felt empowered to do that is because she believes that working for you gives her special authority. Where do you think she got that idea? Camilla's composure finally cracked. I resent the implication that I've somehow encouraged inappropriate behavior. Do you? Because I'm not making implications. I'm stating facts. Your staff member felt confident enough to threaten a palace guard employment in the middle of a corridor during regular working hours where anyone might have overheard. That level of brazenness doesn't develop in isolation. You're being unfair, Camilla protested. Unfair? Anne's voice rose. What's unfair is a dedicated employee being subjected to workplace bullying. What's unfair is protocols that have kept this family safe for decades being dismissed by someone who doesn't understand their purpose. What's unfair is using your position to intimidate people who can't fight back. Charles stood up, clearly agitated by the escalating tension. Both of you need to step back and approach this more calmly. And looked at her brother with genuine affection, but unwavering determination. Charles, I love you, and I respect your desire to maintain harmony. But some things are more important than keeping the peace. And the treatment of the people who serve this family is one of those things. She turned back to Camilla. I want Margaret Thornfield dismissed. Today, the silence that followed was deafening. Camilla stared at Anne in shock, while Charles looked like he was mentally calculating the potential consequences of such a drastic action. You can't be serious, Camilla said finally. I'm completely serious, Anne replied. She demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of her role. She engaged in behavior that would be ground for dismissal in any professional environment, and she did it all in your name. If you want to maintain any credibility with the rest of the palace staff, you need to make it clear that such behavior has consequences. That's rather extreme, Charles said weakly. Is it? Because I think what's extreme is allowing workplace bullying to continue unchecked. I think what's extreme is permitting someone to threaten the livelihood of a 15-year palace veteran because she's drunk on borrowed power. And walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where she had played as a child, where she had learned the values of service and dedication that had shaped her entire life. When she turned back to face them, her expression had shifted from anger to something deeper, disappointment. You know what troubles me most about this situation? It's not just that Margaret Thornfield behaved inappropriately. It's that she felt confident she could get away with it. And the only way someone develops that kind of confidence is if they believe the people above them will protect them regardless of their behavior. Camilla's face went white. That's not fair, isn't it? Because from where I stand, it looks like your first instinct was to minimize what happened, to suggest that I was overreacting, to find excuses rather than take responsibility. Anne's voice remained calm, but her words cut deep. And that tells me everything I need to know about the culture you've created among your staff. Charles made one more attempt at mediation. Surely we can find a middle ground here. Perhaps additional training or a formal reprimand? No, and said firmly. There is no middle ground when it comes to basic human decency. Either we maintain standards of professional behavior, or we don't. Either we protect the people who serve this family, or we abandon them to whoever feels like exercising power over them. She looked directly at Camilla. Margaret Thornfield crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. And if you're not willing to hold her accountable, then you're telling every other member of your staff that they can behave the same way without consequences. The room fell silent again as the implications of Anne's ultimatum settled over them. This wasn't just about one staff member anymore. It was about the fundamental question of how power would be exercised within the modern royal household. And walked toward the door, then paused. I've made my position clear. Margaret Thornfield's behavior was unacceptable, and she needs to face the consequences. If you're not willing to dismiss her, then I'll take this matter to the appropriate authorities myself. As she reached for the door handle and delivered her final statement. But understand this. If I have to intervene directly, the consequences will extend far beyond one staff member's employment status. The 24 hours following Princess Anne's ultimatum passed with the kind of tense anticipation that only occurs when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Throughout the palace, staff members sensed that something significant was unfolding, though few understood the full scope of what was at stake, and spent those hours doing exactly what she had done for decades, focusing on her duties while simultaneously preparing for the battle she knew was coming. She reviewed personnel files, consulted with senior household staff, and quietly gathered information about other incidents that might have occurred but gone unreported. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. Margaret Thornfield's treatment of James Morrison was not an isolated incident. Over the past 6 months, there had been a pattern of increasingly aggressive behavior from several members of Camilla's staff toward long-serving palace employees. Most of these incidents have been dismissed as personality conflicts or communication issues, and recognized them for what they really were: systematic abuse of power by people who had misunderstood their role in the royal hierarchy. Meanwhile, Charles found himself caught between his wife's wounded pride and his sister's unwavering principles. He had hoped that a night's reflection might cool tempers and allow for a more diplomatic resolution, but he had underestimated both women's determination to stand their ground. Camilla, for her part, had spent the evening in heated consultation with her closest advisors. Some counseled compromise, suggesting that sacrificing Margaret Thornfield might be necessary to maintain peace with Anne. Others, however, argued that backing down would be seen as weakness and would undermine Camilla's authority with her entire team. The decision, when it came, surprised no one who truly understood Princess Anne's character. At precisely 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Anne's private secretary contacted the palace personnel office with a formal request. Margaret Thornfield's access credentials were to be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation into workplace misconduct allegations, and had not waited for Charles or Camilla to act. She had exercised her own authority as a senior member of the royal family to initiate the process that would remove Margaret from her position. It was a bold move, one that effectively bypassed the normal chain of command and forced everyone else to respond to her initiative rather than their own. The news spread through the palace like wildfire. Margaret Thornfield arrived for work to find her security pass deactivated and a summons to report immediately to the personnel office. Within an hour, she was clearing out her desk under the watchful eye of security personnel. But it was just getting started. Her investigation had revealed that the problems extended far beyond Margaret Thornfield, and she was determined to address them systematically and thoroughly. By noon, 2 other members of Camilla's staff found themselves under formal review for similar incidents of inappropriate behavior toward palace employees. The speed and decisiveness of Anne's actions sent shockwaves through the entire royal household. This wasn't the gradual, committee-based approach that usually characterized palace decision-making. This was swift, uncompromising justice administered by someone who had clearly reached the limits of her tolerance. Charles received word of Anne's actions while he was in a meeting with government officials. The interruption came in the form of a discreet note from his private secretary, but the contents were anything but discreet. His sister had effectively declared war on workplace bullying within the palace, and she was prosecuting that war with the kind of efficiency that had made her the most productive member of the royal family. When Charles finally confronted in that afternoon, he found her in her office, calmly reviewing additional personnel files with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else in her life. "You couldn't wait, could you?" he said, closing the door behind him, and looked up from her papers. "Wait for what, Charles? For more dedicated employees to be humiliated? For the situation to get worse? For you to find another excuse to avoid making difficult decisions? You've put me in an impossible position," Charles said, sinking into the chair across from her desk. "No," and replied firmly, "I've put you in the position you should have been in from the beginning. You're the king, Charles. These people work for you, all of them, and it's your responsibility to ensure they're treated with dignity and respect." Charles ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded him of their childhood arguments. "Camilla is furious. She feels like you've undermined her authority." "Her authority?" Anne's voice rose slightly. "Charles, authority isn't a privilege. It's a responsibility. And when people abuse the authority they've been given, they lose the right to exercise it." She stood up and moved to the window, the same window where she had stood the day before while delivering her ultimatum. "Do you know what James Morrison said to me this morning when I checked on him?" Charles shook his head. "He thanked me. A man who has served this family for 15 years, who has never asked for anything except the respect that any human being deserves, thanked me for treating him like he mattered," and turned back to face her brother. "When was the last time someone thanked you just for doing the right thing?" Charles was quiet for a long moment. "The other staff members you've suspended are being given due process," and interrupted. "They'll have the opportunity to explain their actions and defend themselves. But they won't be doing it while continuing to exercise authority over the people they've been mistreating. And if the investigation clears them," and met his gaze steadily, "then they'll be reinstated with a clear understanding of what behavior is expected going forward. But, Charles, based on what I've already uncovered, I don't think that's likely to happen." She returned to her desk and picked up a thick folder. "Would you like to know what I've discovered in less than 24 hours of looking into this matter?" Charles nodded reluctantly. 17 separate incidents over the past 6 months involving inappropriate behavior by members of Camilla's staff toward long-serving palace employees. 17, Charles. And those are just the ones people were willing to report after I made it clear that there would be no retaliation for coming forward. The number hit Charles like a physical blow. 17. Everything from verbal abuse to threats of dismissal to attempts to override established security protocols. And opened the folder and pulled out several documents. Here's a gardener who was told he needed permission from Camilla's office before speaking to any member of the royal family. Here's a housekeeper who was reprimanded for not curtsying deeply enough when one of Camilla's assistants entered the room. Here's a cook who was told that his 40 years of service meant nothing if he couldn't adapt to new management expectations. Charles stared at the documents in horror. "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," and said, "but not unkindly. Because these people respect you too much to burden you with their problems. They assumed that this was just how things were going to be now, and they tried to adapt because they love this family and they love their work." She closed the folder and looked directly at her brother. "But I'm not going to let them suffer in silence. Not on my watch." The door opened suddenly, and Camilla entered without knocking. Her face was flushed with anger, and she clearly had not expected to find Charles there. "I want to know exactly what you think you're doing," she said, addressing him with barely controlled fury. "I'm protecting the people who serve this family," and replied calmly. "Something that should have been done months ago. You had no right to suspend my staff members without consulting me," and stood up slowly, and the change in her posture was unmistakable. "I had every right, and more importantly, I had every responsibility. When people abuse their positions, someone has to hold them accountable. Those were isolated incidents blown out of proportion, 17 incidents, and interrupted. 17 separate occasions where your staff members forgot that they work for this family not the other way around. Camilla turned to Charles. Are you going to let her destroy everything I've worked to build here? Charles looked between his wife and his sister, and for a moment, the weight of his position seemed almost overwhelming. But then he thought about James Morrison's years of faithful service, about the gardener who had been forbidden to speak to his own employers, about the cook whose decades of dedication had been dismissed by someone who had been there for months. Camilla, he said quietly, 17 incidents. They were misunderstandings, no, Charles said, his voice growing stronger. 17 incidents means there was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. And addressed it. The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla stared at her husband in shock, clearly not having expected him to support his sister's drastic actions, and felt no satisfaction in the moment. She had never wanted this confrontation, had never desired to create conflict within the family. But some principles were more important than family harmony, and the protection of dedicated employees was one of them. What happens now? Camilla asked finally. Now, and said, we rebuild. We make it clear to everyone who works here that they will be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. We establish clear standards of professional behavior that apply to everyone, including senior staff members. And we create mechanisms for reporting inappropriate conduct without fear of retaliation. She looked at both Charles and Camilla. And we remember that leadership means serving others, not being served by them. Over the following weeks, the changes and had initiated continued to ripple through the palace. The investigation into the suspended staff members revealed a pattern of behavior that was even worse than initially suspected. Margaret Thornfield and 2 of her colleagues were permanently dismissed, while others received formal reprimands and mandatory training on appropriate workplace conduct. But the most significant change was cultural, and had made it clear that proximity to power did not grant license for abuse, and that message resonated throughout the entire royal household. Staff members who had previously felt voiceless suddenly found that their concerns were being heard and addressed. James Morrison, the guard whose humiliation had started it all, received a formal commendation for his years of faithful service. When and presented it to him in a small ceremony attended by other long-serving staff members, his words were simple but profound. Thank you for reminding us that we matter. And those words captured everything she had been fighting for. In a world where power often corrupted and position frequently led to arrogance, she had struck a blow for basic human dignity. She had demonstrated that true leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, even when doing so created personal difficulties. The relationship between and Camilla remained strained for months afterward. They maintained the courtesies required by their positions, but the warmth that had characterized their earlier interactions was gone. Charles worked hard to rebuild bridges between them, but some things once broken could not be easily repaired. However, the palace itself became a better place to work. New policies were implemented to prevent workplace harassment. Regular training sessions were instituted for all staff members regardless of rank, and anonymous reporting mechanisms were established to ensure that problems could be identified and addressed before they escalated. And never regretted her actions, though she sometimes wondered if there might have been a more diplomatic way to achieve the same results. But every time she saw James Morrison at his post, every time she encountered one of the other staff members who had been affected by the changes she had initiated, she knew she had made the right choice. Because in the end, being a princess wasn't about wearing a crown or attending state dinners or having your photograph taken at charity events. Being a princess, being a leader of any kind, was about using whatever power you possessed to protect those who needed protection, to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and to ensure that basic human dignity was preserved even in the most hierarchical of institutions. Princess Anne had not waited for permission, had not sought consensus, had not worried about the political ramifications of her actions. She had seen injustice and had acted to stop it swiftly and decisively. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone around her what true leadership looked like. The guard had been humiliated, but justice had been swift. The staff had lost their access to power, but the palace had gained something far more valuable. A culture where every person, regardless of their position, was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. And Princess, and the woman who had never waited for anyone's permission to do the right thing, had once again proven that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is immediate, uncompromising action taken by someone who refuses to look the other way.